The rain fell in thin, needling sheets over the sleepy town of Trinity Hill, Texas, soaking the cracked sidewalks and darkening the brick of the old sheriff's department. Wind howled through the alleyways, tugging at the yellowed crime scene tape flapping listlessly in the morning light. Beneath the somber clouds, blue and red emergency lights pulsed silently, casting rhythmic flashes across the dewy patrol cars, lining the driveway of a modest two-story house. Inside, the silence was louder than any siren. A single photograph, now stained with spattering grief, lay crooked on the floor, a family portrait. Sheriff Laura Bellamy, in her uniform, smiling between her teenage daughter Emily and her husband Tom. Behind the forced smiles and pristine backdrop was a truth no camera could capture, a house rotting from the inside, hollowed by secrets and fear. The 911 call came in just before dawn. A trembling girl's voice, choked with panic and blood. "My mom, she killed my dad. Please, someone, he was hurting me." Dispatchers froze. The name that came through on the address ping didn't belong to a criminal. It belonged to Sheriff Laura Bellamy, the town's own protector, a woman hailed for her iron sense of justice, a community symbol of strength. But that morning, as first responders pushed to the front door with weapons drawn, they found her kneeling in the center of the living room, her uniform soaked in crimson, hands clasped behind her head, lips sealed. Beside her, sprawled and mutilated, lay her husband's lifeless body, surrounded by a storm of shattered trust and visceral violence. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the seasoned officers, the ones who'd seen cartel bloodbaths and burnt-out meth labs, stood frozen in disbelief. The sheriff, their sheriff, had executed her own husband in a moment that blurred the line between justice and revenge. Outside, news vans were already setting up. The town was about to become a spectacle. But beneath the tabloid-ready headlines was something darker, something that wouldn't fit neatly in a cheering, something that had been festering for years in the quiet moments between bedtime stories and Sunday morning breakfasts. At the heart of it all, a 16-year-old girl stood trembling behind a squad car door, a wool blanket clutched tight around her shoulders, staring at the house where everything had ended and where it had all begun. As the rain intensified and the sky grew heavier, one question echoed to the town like a haunting refrain. What drives a mother, a lawwoman, to become an executioner? Don't forget to subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss the next major crime stories. Long before blood stained her hands and headlines called her a killer, Laura Bellamy was the pride of Trinity Hill. The daughter of a deputy and a schoolteacher, Laura had grown up with discipline etched into her bones and a deep reverence for justice. As a child, she spent more time in the county courthouse and on playgrounds, sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom watching her father testify, taking in every detail of his uniform, the weight of the badge, the stiffness of the collar, the resolute calm in his voice. Justice wasn't an idea to her. It was a legacy, a bloodline. After graduating from Sam Houston State with honors in criminal justice, Laura returned to Trinity Hill with a clear purpose: to serve and protect the very streets where she had learned to ride her bike and recite the Pledge of Allegiance. Over the years, she climbed the ranks, deputy, detective, lieutenant, until finally, at just 38, she was elected sheriff by an overwhelming margin. She wasn't just the first female sheriff in the county's history. She was the most respected, but respect came with a price. Laura's life was a balancing act. Tough on crime, soft with her family. To the public, she was untouchable, a woman who faced down cartel enforcers, brought down a child trafficking ring, and could still bake cookies for the school fundraiser. Behind the uniform, however, she bore the weight of perfection. Mistakes weren't allowed. Vulnerability had no place in the Bellamy household, especially not with a husband like Tom. Tom Bellamy was the kind of man who knew how to wear a mask. He was charming in a way that made women blush and men nod in approval. Tall, with a calm southern drawl and a Bible tucked beneath one arm, he led church prayer groups and volunteered at the local animal shelter. Most of Trinity Hill thought he was a lucky one, married to the sheriff, But those who looked closely, the ones who noticed Laura's sudden hesitations or Emily's too quiet demeanor, saw hints of something not quite right. Tom liked control, and in the confines of their home, away from prying eyes and flashing cameras, that control often twisted into something more insidious. The cracks began to show slowly. Laura, once animated and warm at public events, started withdrawing after dark. Her patrol car stayed parked longer in the sheriff's lot. Her shift stretched past the point of necessity. She used work as a shield, not from criminals, but from the discomfort of her own kitchen. At home, Emily's once bright personality had dimmed. She no longer brought friends over or asked to attend school dances. Her laughter, once frequent, became rare and cautious, the sound of someone constantly bracing for something. Laura noticed. Of course she did. But every time she approached Emily, the girl would retreat behind a polite wall. "I'm fine, Mom," she'd say. "Just tired." There were never bruises, no broken bones, nothing that screamed for help, only a feeling, a gnawing maternal instinct that something had shifted. And when Laura turned to Tom for answers, he'd deflect with ease. "You know how girls get at that age," he'd say, smiling with just the right amount of concern. "She's hormonal, moody. Maybe she needs a therapist or a new phone, something to lift her spirits." And Laura, exhausted and juggling the weight of an entire town's problems, convinced herself that maybe he was right. Maybe she was overthinking it. But deep down, something didn't sit right. Emily had always been quiet, but never afraid, never numb. And lately, she had taken to locking her bedroom door at night. Even though their home sat on the safest street in the safest town in East Texas. Still, Laura said nothing. It was easier, perhaps, to wage war against the evil outside the house than confront the possibility of something vile within it. After all, the Bellamys were admired, respected. Breaking that illusion would fracture not only her home, but her identity. And so she buried it. Buried the doubt, the instinct, the quiet late-night prayers that she was wrong. She poured herself into her job, drowned herself in arrest reports and warrant signings, and tried to forget the way Emily flinched when Tom touched her shoulder. But evil does not stay buried, and masks, no matter how well constructed, eventually slip. That moment would come sooner than anyone expected, violently, unforgivably, on a rainy April morning that would make. Trinity Hill questioned everything they thought they knew about love, family, and justice. The signs were never loud. They whispered instead, in glances avoided, in smiles that never reached the eyes, in footsteps that grew lighter, as if trying not to be heard. And in the Bellamy household, those whispers were ignored for far too long. Emily Bellamy had once been a bright spark of creativity, a quiet girl, yes, but imaginative and curious. She filled notebooks with drawings of forests and fairy tale kingdoms, escaping into stories where monsters were clearly marked and heroes always arrived in time. But by 16, her notebooks had disappeared. Her sketch pad sat untouched on her bedroom desk, covered in dust. The light in her room stayed off more often than on. Even the framed photos on her walls, school field trips, camping memories with her mother, were slowly taken down, replaced with blank space. She stopped looking people in the eye. At school, teachers began to notice. Her once sharp essays became disjointed. Her grades dropped, subtly at first, then more dramatically. Her voice, when she spoke, was faint and delayed, like it had to fight its way out. Mrs. Caldwell, her English teacher, pulled her aside one afternoon. "Is everything okay at home?" she asked gently. Emily nodded too quickly. "Just stressed about exams," she whispered, eyes fixed on the floor. But Mrs. Caldwell wasn't the only one who saw it. Emily's best friend, Chloe, confronted her one afternoon in the library. "You've changed," she said, concern outweighing the accusation. "You're always flinching. You don't laugh anymore. What's going on?" Emily paused, lips parting for a moment as if she might speak. And then she shut her book, smiled too tightly, and walked away. No one pushed harder. After all, the sheriff's daughter had to be safe. At home, the tension had thickened like humidity before a storm. Laura worked later shifts, convincing herself she was just giving Emily space. Or maybe, if she was honest, avoiding the growing sense of dread. She remembered once, coming home early after a stakeout had been called off. She entered quietly, out of habit. The house was dark. From the hallway, she heard murmured voices, Tom's voice too soft, too close, followed by a sudden thud. When she stepped in, Emily was standing stiff in the kitchen, eyes wide, and Tom turned around with a look of irritation that flicked into a grin almost too quickly. "You're home early," he said. Em dropped her phone. "Scared the hell out of both of us." Emily's eyes stayed on the floor. That night, Laura lay awake long after Tom had begun to snore, her hand resting on the service pistol in the nightstand drawer. She stared at the ceiling, chest tight, guilt coiling in her ribs. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong for a long time. And yet, the very idea of naming it, of saying aloud, felt too heavy to carry. A mother's love wrestled with a sheriff's instincts, and denial is a powerful narcotic. Meanwhile, Emily began taking longer showers. She locked her bedroom door religiously. Once, Laura knocked softly, asking to come in. Emily answered after a long pause. Her room smelled faintly of rubbing alcohol. Her sleeves were long, even in spring. Laura didn't ask questions. Not yet. The truth was there, coiled like a snake just beneath the surface. But Laura still clung to the idea that some evil couldn't exist under her roof. Then came the night Emily refused to eat dinner. She sat at the table, face pale, silent. When Tom tried to pass her the peas, her shoulders jolted as if struck. She whispered something unintelligible and stood up abruptly, plate untouched. Tom's eyes followed her with a flicker of something that wasn't paternal concern. Laura saw it. She said nothing, but the image stayed with her. It festered. It gnawed. And then, 2 weeks before the day everything would fall apart, Laura found something she couldn't unsee. Cleaning out the laundry basket, she found one of Emily's notebooks wedged between towels. Inside, instead of drawings or school notes, were pages of frantic scrawled journal entries. "I can't breathe when he's home. I want to tell her, but I think she knows. He said if I say anything, she'll hate me. Sometimes I wish I'd never been born." The final entry was dated 3 days prior. He came into my room again last night. Laura dropped the notebook. The world tilted, time slowed, and the floor beneath her seemed to vanish. Her hands trembled as she clutched the pages, her mind cycling through every moment she had dismissed, every silence she hadn't questioned, every hug she hadn't returned when Emily shrank back. A sheriff's instincts don't fade. They rot when suppressed. That night, Laura sat in her patrol car for hours, unable to go inside. Rain pattered on the windshield, matching the rhythm of her pulse. Her reflection in the rearview mirror didn't look like justice anymore. It looked like shame. But what do you do when the call is coming from inside the house? The answer would come soon, not through due process or the slow wheels of justice, but through the kind of raw, explosive reckoning that tears through lives like fire through dry brush. And when it did, there would be no turning back. It happened on a Sunday. The house was quiet, steeped in a hush that follows a long week, the kind of silence that should have felt restful but instead pressed down like a heavy fog. Sheriff Laura Bellamy had returned home early from church, a rare decision, citing a stomach ache to her deputy. But truthfully, her stomach hadn't been right in weeks. Something inside her had begun to unravel the moment she read Emily's journal. Since then, her gaze had become sharper, her ears tuned to every creak and whisper in their home. She moved like someone walking through a dream she suspected would soon turn into a nightmare. As she stepped into the house, her boots barely made a sound against the polished hardwood. The faint scent of Tom's cologne lingered in the hallway. That familiar, cloying musk she once associated with comfort now made her skin crawl. She paused by the staircase, head tilted, catching a soft thud from above. Then a voice, muffled, strained. Not loud, but urgent. Her heart stuttered. The sound was coming from Emily's room. Laura's breath hitched. The air in the hallway felt thinner now, harder to pull into her lungs. Slowly, she removed her sidearm from its holster, not out of a policing instinct, but something deeper, primal, maternal. A creeping, terrible certainty had taken root inside her. She hadn't intended to come home early, but maybe something had brought her back. Maybe justice, the real kind, didn't care about timing. She ascended the stairs without a word. The hallway was dim, a line of sunlight seeping under Emily's door. Another sound, a low, hoarse whisper. She didn't knock. Laura shoved open the door with one brutal motion. What she saw in that room would follow her forever, not in words, but in flashes. The kind of flashes that never dim. Emily, frozen in place, tears streaking her face, shirt twisted, eyes wide with horror. And Tom, his body partially turned, pants unfastened, his face pale as he registered the figure standing in the doorway. The silence was nuclear. Time seemed to stop. For a brief second, no one moved. Then Tom spoke. "Laura, wait, this isn't—" She didn't let him finish. The scream that tore from Laura's throat was not human. It was the sound of betrayal and guilt and agony compressed into one shattering eruption. She lunged. Tom stumbled backward, caught off guard, scrambling to zip his pants, his eyes flicking toward the door as if to escape. But there would be no escape. Not this time. Not from the truth. Not from her. Laura didn't reach for her gun. Not yet. She tackled him, dragging him from the bed and slamming him to the floor, fists flying unrestrained. The years of doubt, of silence, of blaming herself for not seeing sooner, they all detonated in that moment. Emily sobbed in the corner, curled against the wall, arms wrapped around her knees, rocking and whispering, I'm sorry, over and over. But Laura wasn't listening anymore. Her world had narrowed to the man beneath her, the man she had married, loved, shared a home with, a man who had violated everything sacred, everything human. Tom writhed beneath her, pleading, I didn't touch her, Laura. She came on to me. A sharp crack echoed through the room as Laura struck him again, not with her fist this time, but with the butt of her pistol. Silence followed, thick, staggering. Blood pooled from his temple. He whimpered, groaning, trying to push himself upright. That's when Laura stood, face red, breath ragged. She moved with eerie calm toward her daughter, helping Emily off the floor, wrapping a trembling arm around her. The girl clung to her, trembling, broken. For a fleeting moment, they stayed like that, mother and daughter, locked in a stillness more powerful than words. Then Laura's eyes landed on the knife resting atop Emily's nightstand, a simple stainless steel kitchen knife, a blade she recognized from their own drawer. Her grip tightened. Without a word, Laura turned back to Tom. He was trying to stand, mumbling something incoherent, still denying. That's when Laura made her choice. The law had rules, protocols, procedures, but they weren't made for moments like this. They weren't made for men like him. And in that moment, she ceased to be Sheriff Bellamy. She became something else entirely. The first stab was swift, a warning. The second was surgical, precise. What followed was retribution in its rawest form. By the time Laura stood up, her hands were stained, her chest heaving, her face unreadable. Emily hadn't moved. She stared at the wall, silent, unblinking. The room was still. The air smelled like copper. Outside, a storm had begun to roll in, the first rumble of thunder vibrating through the floorboards. Laura didn't cry. She didn't scream. She took one last look at what remained of the man she had once trusted with her life, and then calmly walked downstairs, dialed 911, and waited. When the officers arrived, she was sitting on the porch, drenched in rain, weapon holstered, hands folded in her lap like a woman awaiting confession. The rain fell in sheets, pounding the roof of the Bellamy house like a war drum. The rhythmic tapping of water against the windows might have been soothing in another life, in another home. But inside those walls, time had frozen. The air was thick with the iron tang of blood, mingled with the sterile scent of soap and the cold sweat of trauma. Tom Bellamy's body lay twisted on the carpet of his daughter's bedroom, a grotesque portrait of a man finally revealed for what he truly was. His face was slack now, his eyes half-lidded in a vacant stare that seemed to mock the quiet horror that hung in the room. Blood had soaked through the fibers beneath him, pooling into the shaggy threads of Emily's pale gray rug. It formed strange shapes, almost like ink blots, staining the innocence of a place once filled with childhood dreams. But this wasn't over. Laura hadn't stopped with just a stabbing. This hadn't been a momentary burst of rage, followed by remorse. It had evolved, slowly, methodically, the calculated dissection of a man who had desecrated everything sacred. She had moved with purpose, driven not by madness but by clarity, a clarity that came only when the blindfolds had finally been ripped away. Tom had begged, not for forgiveness, but for his life. That was a final insult. Lying there, clutching his side, gasping like a dying animal, he'd sputter broken words between gurgled breaths. "Laura, please don't, we can fix this." Fix? There had been no fixing this. There never would be. Laura had stared at him with a numb sort of detachment, the same way she'd once looked at roadkill during rural patrol shifts. Something lifeless, unredeemable. She had made one final decision. With an unsteady hand and a heart numbed by devastation, she'd taken the kitchen knife and lowered herself beside him. Her hands, slick with blood, worked without hesitation. No longer as a sheriff, not even as a mother, but as a woman pushed past her breaking point. She didn't just kill Tom Bellamy. She emasculated him, a grotesque, symbolic act, one that sent a thunderous message from the pit of her soul. It wasn't just revenge. It was justice, carved out by her own hand, where the system had failed her daughter, where she herself had failed. His scream had been short, sharp, desperate. It ended with a sickening gurgle. When it was done, Laura stood there, panting, knees shaking. The blade slipped from her fingers and clattered against the floor. Her reflection stared back at her from the dresser mirror, a face unrecognizable. Blood streaked down her arms. Her uniform splattered in a violent tapestry. Her badge glinted in the overhead light, catching on the edge of one of Emily's old dream catchers, an eerie contrast between hope and horror. Down the hallway, Emily hadn't moved. She sat on the floor outside her door, knees pulled to her chest, wrapped in a blanket now stained by her father's blood. She wasn't crying anymore. Her face was empty, an emotional vacuum where there should have been hysteria. Laura joined her moments later. She didn't speak. She didn't apologize. She simply wrapped her arms around her daughter. There was no sound except the wind pushing rain against the house and the faint creak of it settling beneath their weight. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Neither of them could tell. Eventually, Laura reached for the landline. Her cell phone had a cracked screen and no signal inside these old country walls. She dialed 911 with a surgeon physician, speaking calmly to the operator. "This is Sheriff Laura Bellamy. I need officers and a crime scene team at my residence. One deceased. I am the perpetrator. The victim is my husband." There was a pause. "Please bring someone for my daughter." When the dispatcher stammered a reply, Laura hung up and sat back down beside Emily. Sirens would be there soon. The system she'd once trusted would be knocking at her door. And this time, she would not answer as an officer of the law. She would answer as a mother who'd crossed the line no badge could protect her from. And still, she didn't regret it. Not yet. The storm had passed by the time the first patrol car rolled onto the Bellamy property. The rain had washed away the dust from the gravel drive, but it couldn't cleanse what had happened inside. Lightning still flickered somewhere in the distance, low and tired, as if nature itself was exhaling after bearing witness to something unspeakable. Deputy Roy Granger was the first on scene, a man Laura had trained, mentored, shared countless late shifts with, His boots crunched the wet gravel as he approached the porch, where Laura sat calmly in her blood-soaked uniform, arms resting on her knees, eyes hollow and distant. "Laura," he called gently, unsure whether to approach as a friend or an officer. She turned to him slowly. "It's done," she said, voice devoid of emotion. "Upstairs. He's in Emily's room." Granger hesitated, glancing at her hands, still sticky with blood. Then he noticed a gun on the ground beside her, placed deliberately, almost ceremonially. Inside, the rest of the team moved with grim determination. Crime scene techs in gloves and boot covers stepped over the threshold with cameras, plastic bags, and clipboards. They'd processed hundreds of scenes before, but this one felt different. This wasn't a murder committed in secrecy. It was loud, emotional, drenched in symbolism. Rage had painted the walls of that house. Not in screams or broken furniture, but in the quiet brutality of what had been done. Detective Janice Colton arrived soon after, her lips drawn tight, jaw clenched against the weight of the situation. Laura had once saved her life in a standoff years ago, and now she was leading the case against her. The scene upstairs stopped Colton cold. Tom's body lay spread across the floor, mutilated beyond recognition. What had been done to him was not just violent. It was intimate, surgical, deliberate, not a moment of blind fury, but something worse, a slow burn that had erupted with methodical vengeance. The crime scene techs found the knife first, then the journal. Emily's journal, tucked beneath a pillow, soaked slightly from the blood splatter. Colton skimmed a few entries, and her face turned pale. What she read wasn't just a diary. It was a detailed, heartbreaking account of grooming, coercion, and fear. Emily had never spoken aloud, but on those pages, she had screamed. Meanwhile, paramedics gently guided Emily from the house. She walked as if sleepwalking, a wool blanket wrapped tightly around her, her eyes glassy and far away. A medic tried to speak to her, but she didn't respond, not even a nod. At the sheriff's station, Laura didn't resist booking. She offered her wrist to be cuffed, placed her gun and badge on the desk without being told. When asked if she understood her rights, she nodded once. No tears, no emotion, just a quiet acceptance, as if she'd stepped into her own jail cell long before the steel doors had closed behind her. Before we proceed, kindly like this video and hit the subscribe button for more gripping stories like this. The media explosion was immediate. A sheriff, a respected, decorated officer, had killed her husband in cold blood, mutilated him, and the word incest began slithering into headlines by the second day. News vans parked along the fence line of the Bellamy property, turning the quiet farmhouse into a grotesque circus. The town of Larkspur, population 4,000, became the epicenter of a national scandal. Everyone had known the Bellamys. They'd waved to Tom at the grocery store, admired Laura's strength, her cool-headedness under pressure. Emily had sung at the county fair just last summer, and now they whispered in gas stations and church pews about the monster hiding in plain sight, about how no one had seen the signs, or worse, had seen and looked away. Detective Colton faced public pressure like never before, but she was determined to do things by the book. She interviewed neighbors, school counselors, colleagues, anyone who might shed light on what had really happened inside that family. Patterns emerged. Emily's teachers recalled her slipping grades, her distant eyes. The school nurse remembered a bruise on her rib that Emily claimed was from falling off a horse. A neighbor admitted to hearing shouting through open windows at odd hours. But no one had said anything. Not until now. The autopsy confirmed the story Emily's journal had started to tell. Evidence of long-term trauma. Old injuries that had gone untreated. Silent wounds beneath her skin. Colton reviewed the results with a heavy heart. There was no doubt anymore. Laura had killed a man, but not without cause. The question now was whether the justice system would treat her as a criminal or as a mother who'd done what no system ever had. Back in her holding cell, Laura sat on the edge of the bench, hands folded neatly in her lap, staring straight ahead. The deputies passed her food, but she rarely touched it. She spoke only when spoken to, not out of defiance, but because she had nothing left to say. She had waited too long to act. And when she finally did, it had been too late to save anything but the truth. The courthouse in Larkspur had never seen anything like this. The small, aging building, tucked between the post office and the diner, usually served as a backdrop to mundane civil suits, traffic tickets, and the occasional divorce case. But now, it was the epicenter of a storm. Television trucks lined the street, parked under swaying trees that once provided a quiet escape from the humdrum of small-town life. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation, the kind of tension that clung to walls as much as the dust. The trial of Sheriff Laura Bellamy was the only topic on anyone's lips. From the moment the charges were formally read, a wave of shock had rippled through the community. How could a woman who had spent her life protecting people be capable of such violence? It was an easy story for media to latch onto. The image of a devoted mother, a loyal officer, driven to the edge by the unspeakable betrayal of her husband. But the deeper the investigation went, the more complicated the picture became. The media frenzy was in full swing. News outlets sent anchors to cover the trial, and social media erupted in a tidal wave of commentary. Headlines blared sensational phrases like sheriff turned murderer and mother's revenge, the killing of a monster. Some hailed Laura as a hero, while others painted her as a cold-blooded killer. The country was split down the middle, one camp claiming she had done what any mother would do to protect her child, the other condemning her for taking the law into her own hands. Laura's defense attorney, Charles Hardy, was no stranger to high-profile cases. Tall, silver-haired, and steady as a rock, Hardy understood the power of a narrative. His strategy was clear. He wouldn't deny the act. He couldn't. What he needed was to convince the jury that Laura had done what anyone in her position might have done. She had reacted out of desperation and a maternal instinct to save her daughter from further harm. He painted Tom Bellamy as a monster, using the content of Emily's journal to build his case. On the other side, the prosecution was just as determined to make Laura pay. District Attorney Bill Garrison, a man who had climbed his way up the political ladder on the back of high-profile convictions, saw this trial as a pivotal moment in his career. His opening statements were cutting, laying out the brutality of the crime in stark, clinical terms. He pointed to horrific mutilation of Tom's body, the premeditation in Laura's actions, and the cold, detached manner in which she confessed. She didn't just kill her husband, Garrison said during his opening remarks, his voice reverberating through the courtroom. She destroyed him, in the most degrading, personal way possible. It was an argument that had the room leaning in, hanging on every word. Yet, for all his skill, Garrison's case lacked one crucial element. Any evidence of Laura's mental state, any attempt to understand why she had taken the law into her own hands. It was easy to demonize her, to label her as a vengeful wife. But no one had yet dared to ask the question, what drove her to this breaking point? As the trial progressed, shocking revelations emerged. Emily Bellamy took the stand, her small frame barely visible behind the oversized podium. She was a shadow of the vibrant girl who had once sung at county fairs, her face pale and drawn. She clutched her hands tightly together, her fingers shaking, as she recounted the horrors she had lived with under the roof of her own home. She spoke quietly, the words tumbling out as if each one was a weight she could no longer bear to keep inside. She didn't scream or cry. Her voice was devoid of emotion, her eyes lost in the far distance. I didn't know who to tell, Emily whispered. He said no one would believe me. The defense rested heavily on Emily's testimony. Her words were damning, but they were also heartbreaking. They painted Tom Bellamy as a man who had abused his own daughter for years, a predator who had used his power to silence his victim. It was a theory that aligned perfectly with Laura's actions, and the jury seemed to listen intently, torn between the emotional appeal of mother's love and the horrific truth of the violence that had been inflicted upon Emily. Yet, even as Emily's testimony swayed hearts, there was a sense of unease in the courtroom. The media had already latched onto the incest angle, and no matter how much Laura's defense tried to humanize her, the press only sharpened their focus on the crime's salacious details. They replayed footage of the crime scene, the photos of Tom's mutilated body, while flashing the image of Laura, her face hard and resolute, a woman who had once been a pillar of the community. Her past service, her leadership, meant little now in the eyes of the public. The courtroom was divided. Some jurors shifted in their seats, their faces caught between pity for the mother and condemnation for her brutal actions. Others watched her intently, cold eyes full of suspicion. Was Laura a victim of circumstances, or was she simply a woman who had snapped? Outside the courtroom, things were no better. Protesters gathered in front of the courthouse, holding signs with slogans like "Justice or Emily" and "No one is above the law." Reporters crowded the steps, microphones thrust in the faces of anyone who would speak, whether they were local farmers, teachers, or the random onlooker who had driven in from nearby towns to witness the spectacle. The media covered every angle, spinning every moment for maximum effect. The most damning part, however, was a video of Laura's confession, captured on the body camera of the responding deputy. Her cold, methodical statement, "I killed him," was aired repeatedly. The footage painted her as detached, unremorseful. It was difficult for many to reconcile this image of Laura with the mother who had once taught their children in school, who had served as protector in their small town. Days turned into weeks, and the trial reached its climax. Laura took the stand in her own defense, her voice steady but tinged with sorrow. She didn't deny what she had done. She didn't try to make excuses. She spoke only of Emily, her daughter, her heart. She described the slow realization of the nightmare that had been unfolding under her roof, the horror of piecing it all together. The jury deliberated for just over 2 days, the tension in the courtroom palpable. By the time they returned with their verdict, the entire town had gathered outside, waiting to hear the final word. When the foreperson stood to read the verdict, it was as if the breath of the entire courtroom had been collectively held. Guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom exploded into murmurs, a mixture of shock, relief, and confusion. Laura Bellamy, the sheriff who had once been the pride of Larkspur, was going to prison. The press flashed her image once again, this time as a criminal. But what was even more shocking was the mixed response from the public. Some cheered for justice, relieved that the law had been upheld. Others wept for a mother who had been pushed too far, who had tried and failed to protect her child in a system that had let her down. The media frenzy was far from over. Now, the debate wasn't just about Laura's guilt. It was about the justice system, about the failures that had allowed a predator to lurk in plain sight. And in the midst of it all, one question remained. Had Laura Bellamy been a hero or a villain? As the media storm around Laura Bellamy's trial finally began to subside, a new layer of intrigue emerged, one that wasn't about the crime itself, but about the woman who had committed it. Experts, psychologists, and armchair criminologists from all over the country were now dissecting every detail of her personality, her past, her motivations. What had driven Laura Bellamy to do what she did? Was she simply a mother pushed to the edge, or was there something darker beneath the surface? The psychological profile that emerged over the course of the trial was as complex as the crime itself. At the heart of Laura's actions was a profound sense of betrayal, not just from her husband, but from the very system she had dedicated her life to upholding. Laura had been a sheriff, a woman of authority and resolve. She had always taken pride in being someone others could turn to in times of crisis. To her, the law was a sacred duty. But when the law failed her, when it failed her daughter, her world began to unravel in ways she never imagined. Psychologists speculated that Laura's carefully constructed identity as a protector had been shattered by the dual traumas of discovering her husband's abuse of their daughter and realizing that she had no legal recourse to protect Emily. The system had let her down in the most horrific way possible. As the full scope of Tom Bellamy's actions came to light, his years of manipulation, coercion, and control over Emily, it became clear that Laura had been trapped in a prison of her own making. She had been too close to the case, too invested in maintaining the facade of a perfect family to see the signs earlier. Now, everything she thought she knew about her life, about her family, was a lie. Psychologist Dr. Caroline Moore, a forensic expert who had followed the case closely, provided a chilling analysis of Laura's psychological state. Laura Bellamy is what we might call a type A personality. She was an achiever, someone who prided herself on control, order, and the protection of others. Dr. Moore explained in an interview, when that control was taken away from her, when she realized she had failed to protect her daughter, it triggered a deep sense of helplessness and rage. But more than that, it pushed Laura into a psychological state where she believed she had no other choice but to act. Laura's actions were not those of a cold-blooded killer. Instead, they were the actions of someone who had been worn down over years of emotional abuse, who had reached a point where survival instincts kicked in, and she chose to defend her child, her only remaining tether to the world she once knew, by any means necessary. The murder was not just the act of a vengeful wife, but of a woman who had reached the limit of what she could tolerate. She wasn't just protecting Emily. She was protecting herself, trying to reclaim a sense of control in a situation that had spiraled far beyond her ability to manage. The psychologist who examined Laura also noted the stark contrast between her public persona and the woman behind closed doors. To the town of Larkspur, she had been a pillar of strength, a woman who could do no wrong. But beneath that carefully constructed image, there was a growing fracture. Laura's relationship with her husband had been deteriorating for years, long before she uncovered his abuse of Emily. Tom had been a man of two faces, charming to the outside world, but cruel and manipulative within the walls of their home. According to the psychological experts, Tom's behavior was classic narcissistic abuse, a pattern of control and gaslighting that had left Laura confused and isolated. She had been so thoroughly manipulated by him that she couldn't see the truth until it was too late. By the time Laura began to piece the puzzle together, her own identity had been compromised. She had already sacrificed too much: her peace, her marriage, her sense of self. All that was left was the unrelenting need to protect her daughter at any cost. Dr. Moore also observed that Laura's emotional numbness after the murder could be seen as a coping mechanism. In many cases, when someone commits a violent act in response to long-term emotional or psychological trauma, there is often immediate numbing or detachment from the reality of the crime, she explained. Laura's confession, so matter-of-fact, so devoid of emotion, could be interpreted as a sign that she had compartmentalized the act in her mind, almost as if she were operating in autopilot. She had done what needed to be done, and now it was over. The shocking grief would come later. The psychological detachment, however, did not sit well with the public. To many, it made Laura seem cold, unfeeling, and calculating. The media spun this as evidence of her guilt, that she had planned the murder in advance, that her lack of emotion was proof of her premeditation. But to those with a deeper understanding of trauma and psychological breakdowns, Laura's behavior was a red flag of her psychological collapse under the weight of years of accumulated pain. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Laura's profile was the realization that she had, in many ways, been a victim long before the murder. Her upbringing, her professional life, and even her marriage had all led her down a path of believing that she was in control, that she could fix problems, that she could handle whatever came her way. When her world imploded, she was left with nothing but the crushing realization that she had failed her daughter, failed herself, and failed the people who depended on her. In the months following the trial, as Laura sat in a prison cell awaiting sentencing, psychologists continued to debate whether Laura's actions could be justified, or she was simply a woman who had crossed an unforgivable line. But for Emily, the road to healing was only just beginning. In her own therapy sessions, she began to understand the depths of the trauma she had endured and the complex, entangled relationship she had with her mother. For Laura, the journey of self-reflection and understanding would be far more complicated. The woman who had once believed she had all the answers now found herself in the darkest corner of her mind, questioning everything she had done, everything she had been. The line between hero and villain was never as clear as it appeared. The day of the verdict was a day the small town of Larkspur would never forget. The courthouse, which had been buzzing with activity for weeks, was now a place of tense anticipation. The seats in the courtroom were packed with people, some eager to hear the outcome, others merely there to witness history unfold. The media, ever present and hungry for more, filled the back rows, cameras poised and microphones in hand. Outside, the protesters were back, chanting for justice or Emily, their signs waving in the cool morning air. The town had been divided from the moment the trial began, and now, as the jury filed in, every eye in the room was trained on the door, every heart heavy with the weight of what would come next. When the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict, the room fell into an almost palpable silence. The tension was suffocating, and for a moment, it felt as if time had slowed. Laura Bellamy sat at the defense table, her face unreadable, her eyes fixed on the jury. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, the knuckles white from the pressure. She had braced herself for this moment for weeks, but nothing could truly prepare her for the gravity of what was about to happen. The foreperson cleared their throat, the sound echoing in the stillness of the room. "We, the jury, find the defendant Laura Bellamy guilty of second-degree murder." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, and whispers swirled in the air. For a moment, the room felt like it was spinning, the reality of the verdict settling over everyone like a heavy fog. Laura's breath hitched, but she remained still, her face betraying nothing. It was a verdict she had feared but had expected. She had already come to terms with the fact that she would never be the hero in this story, no matter how much she had wanted to be. She was a mother who had acted out of desperation, but in the eyes of the law, she was still a murderer. Her defense attorney, Charles Hardy, was quick to react. He stood and nodded solemnly as if preparing for the next phase of the trial, the sentencing. It was clear that he had anticipated this outcome. The jury had deliberated for several days, and in the end, they had agreed on a compromise. Guilty of second-degree murder, but not premeditated. Trapped in a prison of her own making. She had been too close to the case, too invested in maintaining the facade of a perfect family to see the signs earlier. Now, everything she thought she knew about her life, about her family, was a lie. Psychologist Dr. Caroline Moore, a forensic expert who had followed the case closely, provided a chilling analysis of Laura's psychological state. Laura Bellamy is what we might call a type A personality. She was an achiever, someone who prided herself on control, order, and the protection of others, Dr. Moore explained in an interview. When that control was taken away from her, when she realized she had failed to protect her daughter, it triggered a deep sense of helplessness and rage. But more than that, it pushed Laura into a psychological state where she believed she had no other choice but to act. Laura's actions were not those of a cold-blooded killer. Instead, they were the actions of someone who had been worn down over years of emotional abuse, who had reached a point where survival instincts kicked in, and she chose to defend her child, her only remaining tether to the world she once knew, by any means necessary. The murder was not just the act of a vengeful wife, but of a woman who had reached the limit of what she could tolerate. She wasn't just protecting Emily. She was protecting herself, trying to reclaim a sense of control in a situation that had spiraled far beyond her ability to manage. The psychologist who examined Laura also noted the stark contrast between her public persona and the woman behind closed doors. To the town of Larkspur, she had been a pillar of strength, a woman who could do no wrong. But beneath that carefully constructed image, there was a growing fracture. Laura's relationship with her husband had been deteriorating for years, long before she uncovered his abuse of Emily. Tom had been a man of two faces, charming to the outside world, but cruel and manipulative within the walls of their home. According to the psychological experts, Tom's behavior was classic narcissistic abuse, a pattern of control and gaslighting that had left Laura confused and isolated. She had been so thoroughly manipulated by him that she couldn't see the truth until it was too late. By the time Laura began to piece the puzzle together, her own identity had been compromised. She had already sacrificed too much, her peace, her marriage, her sense of self. All that was left was the unrelenting need to protect her daughter at any cost. Dr. Moore also observed that Laura's emotional numbness after the murder could be seen as a coping mechanism. In many cases, when someone commits a violent act in response to long-term emotional or psychological trauma, there is often immediate numbing or detachment from the reality of the crime, she explained. Laura's confession, so matter-of-fact, so devoid of emotion, could be interpreted as a sign that she had compartmentalized the act in her mind, almost as if she were operating in autopilot. She had done what needed to be done, and now it was over. The shock and grief would come later. The psychological detachment, however, did not sit well with the public. To many, it made Laura seem cold, unfeeling, and calculating. The media spun this as evidence of her guilt, that she had planned the murder in advance, that her lack of emotion was proof of her premeditation. But to those with a deeper understanding of trauma and psychological breakdowns, Laura's behavior was a red flag of her psychological collapse under the weight of years of accumulated pain. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Laura's profile was the realization that she had, in many ways, been a victim long before the murder. Her upbringing, her professional life, and even her marriage had all led her down a path of believing that she was in control, that she could fix problems, that she could handle whatever came her way. When her world imploded, she was left with nothing but the crushing realization that she had failed her daughter, failed herself, and failed the people who depended on her. In the months following the trial, as Laura sat in a prison cell awaiting sentencing, psychologists continued to debate whether Laura's actions could be justified, or she was simply a woman who had crossed an unforgivable line. But for Emily, the road to healing was only just beginning. In her own therapy sessions, she began to understand the depths of the trauma she had endured and the complex, entangled relationship she had with her mother. For Laura, the journey of self-reflection and understanding would be far more complicated. The woman who had once believed she had all the answers now found herself in the darkest corner of her mind, questioning everything she had done, everything she had been. The line between hero and villain was never as clear as it appeared. The day of the verdict was a day the small town of Larkspur would never forget. The courthouse, which had been buzzing with activity for weeks, was now a place of tense anticipation. The seats in the courtroom were packed with people, some eager to hear the outcome, others merely there to witness history unfold. The media, ever present and hungry for more, filled the back rows, cameras poised and microphones in hand. Outside, the protesters were back, chanting for justice for Emily, their signs waving in the cool morning air. The town had been divided from the moment the trial began, and now, as the jury filed in, every eye in the room was trained on the door, every heart heavy with the weight of what would come next. When the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict, the room fell into an almost palpable silence. The tension was suffocating, and for a moment, it felt as if time had slowed. Laura Bellamy sat at the defense table, her face unreadable, her eyes fixed on the jury. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, the knuckles white from the pressure. She had braced herself for this moment for weeks, but nothing could truly prepare her for the gravity of what was about to happen. The foreperson cleared their throat, the sound echoing in the stillness of the room. We, the jury, find the defendant Laura Bellamy guilty of second-degree murder. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, and whispers swirled in the air. For a moment, the room felt like it was spinning, the reality of the verdict settling over everyone like a heavy fog. Laura's breath hitched, but she remained still, her face betraying nothing. It was a verdict she had feared but had expected. She had already come to terms with the fact that she would never be the hero in this story, no matter how much she had wanted to be. She was a mother who had acted out of desperation, but in the eyes of the law, she was still a murderer. Her defense attorney, Charles Hardy, was quick to react. He stood and nodded solemnly as if preparing for the next phase of the trial, the sentencing. It was clear that he had anticipated this outcome. The jury had deliberated for several days, and in the end, they had agreed on a compromise. Guilty of second-degree murder, but not premeditated. Now, as an adult, Emily had become something of a recluse, not because she didn't want to be heard, but because she could never quite reconcile the girl she had been with the woman she had become. The echoes of her father's violence haunted her, yes, but so too did the silent question that always lingered in her mind. How could a mother do this to her own child? And yet, beneath that question, there was a conflicting sorrow, a sorrow for a mother who had been broken beyond recognition, a sorrow for a family shattered in ways no one could ever undo. Laura, now serving her sentence in a state prison far from Larkspur, had not yet been able to find solace, either. Her days were filled with monotony, the clanging of doors, the whispers of inmates, the stark reality of her life behind bars. The years had begun to weigh on her, and she had often wondered if she would ever find peace within herself. She had lost everything: her career, her family, her freedom. But worse than that, she had lost the one thing that had once defined her: her ability to protect her daughter. As she sat in her prison cell, the reflections on her actions came in waves. She had never meant for it to end the way it had. There had been no grand plan, no forethought, just the rush of adrenaline and the desperate need to protect her daughter from the horrors she had learned of far too late. But the cost of that protection had been too high. A man dead, a daughter broken, and a life lost. In the years since her conviction, Laura had received letters from people across the country, some supporting her, others condemning her. The supporters argued that she had acted out of love and desperation, while the critics saw her as a murderer, no better than the man she had killed. It was a dichotomy that Laura had yet to fully come to terms with. Was she a hero or a villain? Was she a victim or a perpetrator? In the cold solitude of her cell, those questions offered no easy answers. But there had been moments, fleeting moments, when Laura allowed herself to imagine what could have been. What if she had known about the abuse sooner? What if she had taken a different path, had found another way to protect Emily without resorting to violence? These what-ifs were haunting, because there would never be a way to rewrite the past. And that was the hardest truth to live with. For the people of Larkspur, life had moved on, but the shadows of the Bellamy case still lingered in quiet conversations. The sheriff department, once a pillar of the community, had been forced to rebuild its reputation after Laura's fall from grace. Trust had been shattered, and many of those who had once looked to Laura for protection now questioned the very system that had allowed such a tragedy to unfold. They wondered how it had been possible for someone so dedicated to law and order to fall so far, to be caught in the same web of lies and deceit that she had sworn to protect them from. But for all the questions, there was one thing that was certain: Larkspur would never be the same. The Bellamy case had broken the town in ways that couldn't be undone, and no amount of time would ever truly heal the wounds it had caused. Yet, in the quiet corners of the town, there were those who had come to understand the complexities of the story. They saw Laura not just as a murderer, but as a woman who had been pushed to the edge, a mother driven by love and desperation, who had made a tragic decision in a moment of crisis. And they saw Emily, too, not just as a victim, but as someone who had been forced to navigate a world of pain and confusion that no child should ever have to face. The Bellamy case would remain a defining moment in the town's history, a story passed down through generations as a cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked violence, the fragile nature of trust, and the complex interplay between love, loyalty, and betrayal. But it would also serve as a reminder of the human cost of tragedy, of the families torn apart, the lives destroyed, and the hearts that, no matter how hard they tried, could never fully heal. As the story of Laura and Emily Bellamy came to a close, the lingering question remained: was it worth it? What does justice truly look like in a world filled with gray areas? The truth, it seemed, was as elusive as ever, hidden in the spaces between the lines of the law and the pain of the heart. And perhaps that was the most haunting reflection of all. Thank you for joining us in today's deep dive into this chilling true crime story. If you found this tale as gripping and thought-provoking as we have, we encourage you to like this video, subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think? Was Laura Bellamy justified in her actions, or was she forever bound by her choices? We'd love to hear your opinions. Stay tuned for more cases that will leave you questioning the very nature of justice.